June 13, 2025. Under the cover of darkness, Israeli F-35 stealth fighters sliced through Iranian airspace, unleashing a devastating assault on the heart of the Islamic Republic's nuclear program. Explosions illuminate the night sky over Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan as precision-guided munitions find their targets, dealing what Israeli officials call devastating blows to Iran's nuclear infrastructure. For the first time in nearly half a century, the shadow war between Israel and Iran has erupted into open, direct conflict. At the center of this escalating confrontation stand two men whose rivalry has shaped the Middle East for decades. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's iron-willed prime minister, has spent 30 years warning that Iran poses an existential threat to the Jewish state, declaring that Israel will do what we need to do to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. 1,000 miles away in Tehran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the 85-year-old revolutionary who has ruled Iran since 1989, views Israel as the little Satan, a puppet of American imperialism that must be wiped from the map. This is no ordinary Middle Eastern conflict. Iran's network of proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthi in Yemen, has been systematically weakened. Syria's Assad regime has fallen. Iran's axis of resistance lies in ruins. With his regional strategy crumbling, Khamenei faces a stark choice: surrender his nuclear ambitions or watch his regime's power evaporate. For Netanyahu, this represents the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat once and for all. But how did two nations, once unlikely partners with daily flights connecting Tel Aviv to Tehran, become locked in this deadly rivalry? How did a shadow war fought through proxies and cyber attacks finally explode into direct confrontation? The answers lie buried in 5 decades of betrayal, revolution, and the relentless pursuit of power in the world's most volatile region. What you're about to witness is the anatomy of a conflict that began with revolutionary fervor, escalated through decades of covert operations, and now threatens to reshape the global order. From the palaces of Tehran to the bunkers of Tel Aviv, from the proxy battlefields of Lebanon to the uranium enrichment facilities of Iran, this is the story of how the Middle East's most dangerous rivalry finally stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh light of war. To understand how Israel and Iran became locked in this deadly rivalry, we must journey back to a time that seems almost impossible to imagine today, when these two nations were not just friends, but strategic partners. It's 1950, just 2 years after Israel's traumatic birth amid the ashes of the Holocaust and the Arab-Israeli War. The young Jewish state stands isolated, surrounded by hostile Arab neighbors who refuse to accept its existence. Then, from an unexpected corner of the Middle East, comes a lifeline. Iran, under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, becomes the second Muslim-majority nation to recognize the newly formed state of Israel. This isn't mere diplomatic courtesy, it's the foundation of a partnership that will define Middle Eastern geopolitics for nearly 3 decades. Daily El Al flights connect Tel Aviv to Tehran, carrying businessmen, diplomats, and dreams of cooperation. Iranian oil flows to Israeli refineries, fueling the young nation's industrial ambitions, while Israeli technological expertise helps modernize Iran's military and agriculture. In the palaces of Tehran and the modest government buildings of Jerusalem, intelligence secrets are quietly exchanged, binding these unlikely allies against common enemies. At the heart of this alliance stands a fascinating contradiction. Shah Pahlavi, educated in Switzerland and shaped by Western ideals, envisions Iran as a modern power bridging East and West. He sees Israel not as a religious adversary, but as a strategic counterweight to hostile Arab neighbors who threaten both nations' regional ambitions. For Israel's leadership, this Persian partnership represents a diplomatic breakthrough. The country's founding father, David Ben-Gurion, with his shock of white hair and piercing gaze, has crafted what becomes known as the Periphery Doctrine, seeking alliances with non-Arab powers like Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia to break the Arab ring of enmity. Iran, with its ancient Persian pride and modern ambitions, seems the perfect partner in this grand strategy. Together, they weave a fragile tapestry of cooperation, their relationship built on mutual need rather than shared values, always shadowed by the weight of history and the volatility of their region. Yet beneath this promising surface, dangerous currents are gathering strength. In Iran's bazaars and mosques, in the universities of Tehran and the villages of the countryside, resentment grows against the Shah's westernizing policies. Religious clerics whisper of cultural contamination, while students and intellectuals rage against foreign influence and economic inequality. The Shah's secret police, the dreaded Savak, respond with increasing brutality, creating a pressure cooker of opposition that threatens to explode. Israel's presence, once seen as a symbol of Iran's modern aspirations, becomes a lightning rod for those who view the partnership as evidence of the Shah's betrayal of Persian and Islamic values. Throughout the 1970s, as oil wealth transforms Iran's landscape with highways and factories, the internal contradictions deepen. The Shah, isolated in his palaces and surrounded by Western advisors, fundamentally misreads the mood of his people. He sees protest as the work of foreign agitators and communist infiltrators, failing to grasp the profound alienation felt by millions of Iranians who feel left behind by his modernization project. Meanwhile, in the holy city of Qum and in exile in Iraq and France, a network of revolutionary clerics led by a stern-faced Ayatollah named Ruhollah Khomeini plots the overthrow of the monarchy and everything it represents, including its friendship with the Jewish state. Then comes 1979, the year that shatters everything. Like a dam bursting after decades of pressure, the Iranian Revolution erupts with stunning speed and fury. Millions fill the streets of Tehran and other cities, their chants echoing off ancient walls: "Death to the Shah, death to America, death to Israel." The mighty Savak crumbles, the Iranian military refuses to fire on protesters, and within weeks, the man who once seemed unshakable flees his golden throne for a life of bitter exile. From the chaos emerges Ayatollah Khomeini, his gaunt frame and piercing eyes embodying a vision of Islamic purity that demands the destruction of everything the Shah represented. Khomeini's first acts as supreme leader send shockwaves across the region. Israel, once Iran's strategic partner, is now branded the Little Satan, a puppet of the Great Satan, America, and declared an enemy that must be wiped from the face of the earth. In a symbolic act that crystallizes the transformation, revolutionary guards storm the Israeli embassy in Tehran, ransacking its contents and ceremoniously handing the building to Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Liberation Organization. The daily flights cease, the oil stops flowing, and what had been one of the Middle East's most surprising friendships turns to implacable hatred. Across the region, the message resonates: the Revolutionary Islamic Republic of Iran will lead the fight against Israel and its Western supporters. In the revolution's aftermath, the human cost of this dramatic rupture becomes clear. For the Shah, dying of cancer in exile, it marks the end of a dream. His vision of a modern, prosperous Iran allied with the West now buried beneath the black banners of theocracy. For Israeli leaders, gathering in emergency sessions in Jerusalem, the loss of their Persian partner represents a strategic catastrophe, forcing them to confront a new reality where their most important regional ally has become their most dangerous enemy. The substantial Jewish community that had thrived in Iran for centuries now faces persecution, while Israeli diplomats and businessmen who had built careers on the Tehran-Tel Aviv axis watched their life's work crumble. What neither side could foresee in those chaotic months of 1979 was how this ideological rupture would eventually metastasize into something far more dangerous than simple enmity. The revolution had planted the seeds of a shadow war that would unfold through proxies and covert operations, drawing in superpowers and threatening regional stability for decades to come. For if open alliance had once seemed impossible, the coming years would prove that even mortal enemies sometimes find reasons to cooperate when survival itself hangs in the balance. With diplomatic relations severed and ideological lines drawn in blood, Israel and Iran faced a deadly dilemma. Open war was too costly, too dangerous for both sides, but surrender was unthinkable. And so began a shadow war, a conflict fought not on traditional battlefields, but through proxies, assassinations, and covert operations that would span 4 decades and reshape the Middle East. At the center of this emerging darkness stood 2 men whose strategic visions would define a generation of conflict. Ayatollah Khamenei, the revolutionary leader determined to export his Islamic uprising across the region, and a rising Israeli politician named Benjamin Netanyahu, already obsessed with what he saw as Iran's existential threat to the Jewish state. Iran's opening move in this shadow war came in 1982, amid the chaos of Israel's invasion of Lebanon to root out Palestinian militants. From the rugged mountains of the Bekaa Valley, Iranian Revolutionary Guard trainers began forging a new weapon, Hezbollah, a Shia militant organization that would become the crown jewel of Iran's emerging axis of resistance. Under Khamenei's guidance, these trainers transformed scattered Lebanese militias into a disciplined force armed with Iranian weapons, funded by Iranian money, and animated by Iranian ideology. Their mission was simple yet devastating: strike at Israel's northern border without giving Tehran's enemies a clear target for retaliation. For Khamenei, Hezbollah represented more than just another militia. It was proof that his Islamic revolution could transcend borders, that oppressed Shia communities everywhere could be awakened to resist Western and Israeli influence. The aging cleric, his black turban marking him as a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, saw each Hezbollah rocket as a blow against the enemies of Islam. Meanwhile, across the border, Israeli military planners watched with growing alarm as a new threat emerged on their northern flank. Among the voices calling for aggressive action was a young Benjamin Netanyahu, already warning that Iran posed an unprecedented danger to Israel's survival. But even as Iran armed Israel's enemies, the shadow war revealed its first stunning paradox. During the brutal Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, a conflict that would claim nearly 1 million lives, Israel secretly provided military equipment to Iran, the very nation whose leaders called for its destruction. The calculation was coldly pragmatic. Saddam Hussein's Iraq posed a more immediate threat than Khamenei's Iran. Israeli arms dealers, operating through intermediaries, shipped vital spare parts for American-made weapons to keep Iran's military functioning against Iraqi forces. It was, as one intelligence official later described it, a marriage of convenience between mortal enemies united only by their shared fear of Saddam's ambitions. This covert cooperation revealed the shadow war's essential character. Ideology mattered less than survival, and yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's temporary ally when circumstances demanded it. For Iran, accepting Israeli weapons was a bitter necessity. Without them, Saddam's forces might have reached Tehran itself. For Israel, the logic was equally stark. Better to arm Iran temporarily than allow Iraq to emerge as the Middle East's dominant power. But this secret partnership carried a terrible irony. The weapons Israel provided helped Iran survive long enough to become the regional superpower that would later threaten Israel's very existence. The Iran-Iraq War's end in 1988 marked a pivotal transformation in Tehran's strategy. The conflict had taught Iran's leaders 2 harsh lessons. First, that they needed powerful weapons, missiles, and ultimately nuclear capabilities to deter future attacks. And second, that Iran was dangerously isolated in a region where most governments opposed their revolutionary agenda. Under the guidance of Ali Khamenei, who succeeded Khamenei as supreme leader in 1989, Iran embarked on an ambitious project to build a network of proxy forces that could strike its enemies without direct Iranian involvement. Beyond Hezbollah, Iran's tentacles reached into Gaza, where it supported Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in their fight against Israeli occupation. In Yemen, Iranian advisors helped arm and train the Houthi, a Shia rebel movement that would later threaten Saudi Arabia and disrupt global shipping lanes. Across Iraq, Iran cultivated dozens of Shia militias that could challenge any government not aligned with Tehran's interests. For Israeli strategists like Netanyahu, now rising through the ranks of Israel's political establishment, this network represented an existential nightmare, a ring of enemies surrounding Israel, all armed and funded by a revolutionary regime bent on the Jewish state's destruction. Yet in this shadow war of proxies and covert operations, the heaviest price was paid not by the strategists in Tehran and Jerusalem, but by the ordinary people caught in the crossfire. Lebanese villages became battlegrounds between Hezbollah and Israeli forces. Gazan families endured cycles of violence as Hamas rockets triggered devastating Israeli retaliation. Israeli border communities lived under constant threat, their children growing up to the sound of air raid sirens. The shadow war had created a geography of suffering that stretched across the Middle East, where proxy conflicts allowed distant powers to pursue their strategic objectives while local populations bore the human cost. But even as Iran built its proxy empire and Israel developed its own covert capabilities, a darker shadow was beginning to loom over the region. In the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War, Khamenei made a fateful decision that would transform the shadow war into something far more dangerous. Reversing his predecessor's religious objections to weapons of mass destruction, Iran's new supreme leader told his nuclear scientists, "We need it now." With those words, the Islamic Republic embarked on a nuclear program that would eventually force the shadow war out of the darkness and into the harsh light of direct confrontation. As Iran's proxy forces struck from the shadows and Israel honed its covert responses, the undercurrents of their conflict were already shifting toward a far graver threat. Emerging from the scars of the Iran-Iraq War, Tehran's leadership recognized a need for a deterrent beyond militias and hidden operations. Under Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, a strategic pivot was set in motion, one that would elevate their rivalry from regional clashes to a crisis with worldwide stakes, forcing Israel into an impossible dilemma between silent sabotage and all-out confrontation. For Khamenei, the decision was born from the trauma of war. During 8 brutal years of conflict with Iraq, Saddam Hussein's ballistic missiles had rained down on Iranian cities while the world largely ignored Tehran's suffering. Chemical weapons scarred Iranian soldiers, and the international community's silence taught Iran's leaders a harsh lesson. In a dangerous neighborhood, only power commanded respect. Unlike his predecessor Ayatollah Khamenei, who had declared nuclear weapons un-Islamic, Khamenei saw them as essential for Iran's survival. The aging cleric, his right arm paralyzed from an assassination attempt decades earlier, understood that ideology meant nothing if the state itself could be destroyed. Across the region, Israel watched Iran's nuclear ambitions with mounting dread. For Israeli leaders, the specter of a nuclear-armed Iran represented the ultimate nightmare, an existential threat that could erase the Jewish state with a single weapon. Leading the charge against Iran's nuclear program was Benjamin Netanyahu, a politician whose warnings about Iranian intentions would define his career for 30 years. Netanyahu's obsession with Iran began early, rooted in his understanding of Jewish history and the fragility of Israeli security. From his first major speech to the US Congress in 1996, he painted Iran as an existential threat, warning that if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, this could presage catastrophic consequences. By 2005, Netanyahu's warnings had evolved into action. Working closely with American intelligence, Israel launched one of the most sophisticated cyber warfare campaigns in history. The operation, codenamed Stuxnet, was a masterpiece of digital sabotage designed to cripple Iran's uranium enrichment program without leaving fingerprints. The virus infiltrated the computer systems controlling Iran's centrifuges at Natanz, causing them to spin out of control while displaying normal readings to Iranian operators. For months, Iranian nuclear scientists watched in frustration as their equipment mysteriously failed, unaware that their facilities had been compromised by an invisible enemy. But cyber warfare was only the beginning. Between 2010 and 2020, A systematic campaign of assassinations targeted Iran's nuclear scientists, with Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the father of Iran's nuclear program, killed in November 2020 by a remote-controlled machine gun in an operation that bore all the hallmarks of Israeli intelligence. Each assassination sent the same message: Iran's nuclear program would face consequences. For Netanyahu, these operations represented necessary survival tactics against an enemy that had sworn to destroy Israel. For Iran, they constituted state terrorism, proof that Israel would stop at nothing to maintain its regional nuclear monopoly. In 2015, diplomacy seemed to offer an alternative to violence. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated between Iran and world powers, including the United States, promised to place strict limits on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. President Barack Obama championed the deal as a path to peace, declaring that the international community will be able to verify that the Islamic Republic of Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon. But Netanyahu viewed the agreement as a catastrophic mistake, calling it an historic error that legitimized Iran's nuclear program while providing only temporary constraints. The nuclear deal's fate was sealed when Donald Trump entered the White House in 2017. Unlike Obama, Trump saw eye to eye with Netanyahu on Iran, declaring the nuclear agreement one of the worst deals ever made by any country. In May 2018, during a dramatic presentation featuring slideshow graphics and props, Netanyahu revealed what he claimed was evidence of Iran's continued nuclear deception. Days later, Trump withdrew the United States from the nuclear deal, reimposing crippling sanctions on Iran and setting the stage for a new escalation. The decision delighted Netanyahu, but enraged Iranian leaders, who accused America of breaking its word and destroying the possibility of peaceful resolution. The consequences of Trump's withdrawal became clear by 2023, when international inspectors detected uranium particles enriched to 83.7%, dangerously close to the 90% needed for nuclear weapons. Iran's nuclear program, freed from the deal's constraints, had accelerated dramatically. For Israeli intelligence analysts briefing Netanyahu, the numbers represented a closing window of opportunity. Iran was approaching what experts called the point of no return, the moment when its nuclear knowledge and materials would make weaponization inevitable. The aging prime minister, now in his 70s but still driven by the same fears that had motivated him for decades, faced the ultimate decision: strike now or accept a nuclear-armed Iran. Behind the technical discussions of enrichment percentages and missile ranges lay profound human consequences that both leaders seemed determined to ignore. In Israeli communities near potential targets, families installed bomb shelters and practiced evacuation drills, their children growing up with the constant awareness of existential threat. In Iran, ordinary citizens bore the burden of international sanctions, while their government pursued nuclear ambitions many privately questioned. The nuclear standoff had transformed millions of lives across the Middle East, creating a generation that knew only tension, threat, and the shadow of potential annihilation. By early 2025, the nuclear question had become inextricably linked to broader regional upheaval. With Hamas weakened, Hezbollah degraded, and Syria's Assad fallen, Iran found itself increasingly isolated, while Netanyahu saw a window of unprecedented opportunity. The nuclear facilities that Khamenei had built as symbols of Iranian power had become targets in an Israeli leader's crosshairs. The question that had haunted the Middle East for 2 decades was about to be answered not through diplomacy or deterrence, but through the raw calculus of military force. The shadow war was about to become something far more dangerous. By 2023, the nuclear standoff between Israel and Iran had reached a deadly equilibrium. Israel's sabotage campaigns had slowed but not stopped Iran's uranium enrichment, while Iran's proxy network continued to threaten Israeli borders. Both sides seemed locked in their familiar shadow war, each probing for advantage while avoiding direct confrontation. Then, on October 7, 2023, everything changed. In a coordinated assault that would reshape the Middle East, Hamas fighters breached Israel's border defenses and launched the deadliest attack on Israeli soil since the nation's founding. Over 1,100 Israelis were killed in a single day, their bodies scattered across kibbutzim and music festivals, while hundreds more were dragged into Gaza as hostages. For Benjamin Netanyahu, now in his 70s, but driven by the same fears that had motivated him for decades, October 7th represented both a catastrophic intelligence failure and an unprecedented opportunity. The attack had shattered Israel's sense of invulnerability, but it also provided the political cover he needed to pursue his ultimate objective: the complete dismantling of Iran's regional network and nuclear program. Within hours of the attack, Netanyahu was convening emergency cabinet sessions, his weathered face etched with the determination that had defined his career. "We will change the Middle East," he declared to his war cabinet, though few understood the full scope of what he had in mind. What Netanyahu understood, and what Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei would soon discover, was that October 7th had fundamentally altered the regional balance of power. Israel's devastating response in Gaza didn't just target Hamas, it systematically destroyed the infrastructure and personnel of Iran's most important proxy. Month after month, Israeli forces ground down Hamas's military capabilities, killing its leaders and collapsing its tunnel networks. But Netanyahu's strategy extended far beyond Gaza. In a carefully coordinated campaign, Israeli operations began targeting Iran's entire axis of resistance, the network of proxies that had taken decades to build and had been the cornerstone of Iran's regional influence. By mid-2024, the shadow war's restraints were cracking. In April, Israeli jets struck the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing senior Revolutionary Guard commanders in what amounted to an attack on Iranian soil. 3 months later, in July, Israeli operatives assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's political leader, while he was visiting Tehran as a guest of the Iranian government. The killing, carried out in the heart of Iran's capital, was a humiliation that exposed the regime's inability to protect even its most important allies. Each strike sent the same message that Netanyahu had been broadcasting for 3 decades. Iran's nuclear program and regional ambitions would face consequences, and Israel's reach extended far beyond its borders. For Khamenei, watching his carefully constructed regional empire crumble, each Israeli strike represented not just a tactical defeat, but a personal affront to his life's work. The aging supreme leader, his right arm still paralyzed from a 1981 assassination attempt, had spent 35 years building Iran's proxy network as a shield against exactly this kind of assault. Now, as reports reached him of another dead commander, another severed alliance, Khamenei faced the most dangerous moment of his reign. His inner circle watched nervously as their leader, usually calm and calculating, showed signs of the fury that had driven Iran's revolution decades earlier. The final blow to Iran's regional strategy came in December 2024, when Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime collapsed after 13 years of civil war. Assad's fall severed Iran's crucial land bridge to Hezbollah in Lebanon, cutting off weapons supply routes that had taken decades to establish. For Israel, Assad's departure represented a strategic windfall. Syrian airspace was now open, providing a clear corridor for future strikes on Iran. Netanyahu's government moved quickly to destroy any remaining Iranian assets in Syria, eliminating weapons depots and infrastructure that could threaten Israeli interests. With Syria lost and its proxies weakened, Iran found itself more isolated than at any point since the Islamic Revolution. By early 2025, Netanyahu sensed that his moment had arrived. With Iran's proxy network in ruins and international attention focused elsewhere, Israel had a window of opportunity that might never come again. The uranium enrichment facilities that had haunted Israeli nightmares for 2 decades were more vulnerable than ever. Iran's air defenses had been degraded by previous strikes, and the United States, under Donald Trump's unpredictable leadership, seemed willing to support decisive action. On June 13, 2025, Netanyahu gave the order that would transform 46 years of shadow war into open conflict. The Israeli assault on Iran's nuclear facilities was a masterpiece of military coordination that had been years in the planning. Wave after wave of F-35 stealth fighters, supported by tanker aircraft and electronic warfare platforms, penetrated deep into Iranian airspace. Their targets were specific and devastating: the uranium enrichment centrifuges at Natanz, the underground facility at Fordow, and the research installations at Isfahan. Within hours, Iran's nuclear program had suffered damage that would set it back years, possibly decades. But Netanyahu's gamble went beyond nuclear facilities. Israeli strikes also hit Revolutionary Guard bases, missile production sites, and key infrastructure, sending an unmistakable message that the age of restraint was over. Iran's response came within hours. Supreme Leader Khamenei, facing the greatest crisis of his 36-year rule, authorized massive retaliation. Iranian ballistic missiles and drones streaked across the Middle East, targeting Israeli cities and the American air base at Al Udeid in Qatar, where 10,000 US troops were stationed. For the first time since the Islamic Revolution, Iran had directly attacked American forces, crossing a red line that had held for over 4 decades. The shadow war had become a multi-front conflict threatening to engulf the entire region. In the hours after Israel's warplanes left Natanz and Fordow in flames, grief moved faster than any missile. Iranian state television broke away from political speeches to scroll the stark toll announced by the health ministry: at least 935 people dead and 5,332 wounded in 12 days of bombardment. Morgues in Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz overflowed. Refrigerated lorries parked outside hospitals became makeshift mortuaries, their engines humming beside families reciting prayers for children who never came home. Across the border, the price was no less cruel. When Iran's retaliation crashed through Israel's layered defenses, 29 Israelis were killed and more than 3,400 injured, according to data compiled by Hebrew University of Jerusalem and reported by regional media. Sirens in Ashkelon and Tel Aviv fell silent only long enough for funeral processions to wind through streets still littered with shrapnel. Doctors on both sides told reporters they had amputated more limbs in 48 hours than in any week of the 2014 Gaza war, a grim arithmetic that military briefings never mention. In this brief, vicious passage from shadow war to open fire, the calculus of victory was measured not in targets destroyed, but in hospital beds filled and futures erased. The human cost of the shadow war's transformation into open conflict was immediate and devastating. Ordinary people caught between the ambitions of leaders they had no power to control. Then, as suddenly as it had escalated, the crisis took an unexpected turn. On June 24, 2025, President Donald Trump posted a message on his Truth Social platform that would reshape the conflict once again. Israel and Iran came to me almost simultaneously and said, "Peace. I knew the time was now. Ceasefire is now in effect. Please do not violate it." With characteristic grandiosity, Trump claimed credit for ending a crisis that had brought the world to the brink of a wider war. But behind his social media diplomacy lay hard questions about what this latest chapter in the Israel-Iran conflict had truly accomplished, and whether the shadow war's emergence into daylight marked its end or simply a new, more dangerous beginning. On June 24, 2025, President Donald Trump's unexpected social media announcement of a ceasefire between Israel and Iran brought a temporary halt to a conflict that had erupted into open warfare just days earlier. For the first time in nearly half a century, the shadow war had stepped into the harsh light of direct confrontation, leaving behind damaged nuclear facilities, shattered infrastructure, and a Middle East teetering on the edge of wider chaos. But as the dust settles over Tehran and Tel Aviv, the question looms larger than ever. Has this violent chapter resolved anything or merely set the stage for a more dangerous future? For Benjamin Netanyahu, the strikes on Iran's nuclear sites at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan represent a significant, if incomplete, victory. Intelligence assessments suggest the attacks have set Iran's nuclear program back by 18 to 24 months, a critical delay in Israel's long-standing mission to prevent a nuclear-armed adversary. Yet, the program's core knowledge and dispersed infrastructure remain intact. Israeli analysts briefing Netanyahu late into the night warned that without sustained pressure, Iran could rebuild, potentially faster than expected, using lessons learned from this assault. Across the region in Tehran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei faces a crisis of legacy at 85 years old. Having ruled since 1989, he has spent decades crafting Iran's regional influence through proxies and nuclear ambitions as a shield against enemies like Israel and the United States. Now, with his axis of resistance in ruins and nuclear facilities crippled, Khamenei must confront not just external threats, but internal dissent. Reports of succession planning discussions within Iran's clerical elite signal a regime at a crossroads. Will a new leader seek pragmatic engagement or double down on hardline defiance? The ceasefire halted the bombs, but it did not quiet the despair. In the industrial city of Isfahan, satellite images captured by international analysts show repair tents rising over the cratered Natanz complex, even as nearby neighborhoods remain without reliable electricity or clean water, the grid crippled by precision strikes that reached far beyond uranium halls. Long queues for bread and fuel, scenes once associated with sanctions years, returned to Tehran within a week, giving harsh substance to warnings that Israel's wider campaign aimed to leave the clerical state vulnerable, weak, isolated. Across the Mediterranean littoral, Israeli mental health hotlines reported record call volumes. Counselors told public radio that every fresh alert reopened the psychological wounds left by October 7 and the missile nights that followed, a trauma magnified each time children asked whether the Iron Dome could stop a nuclear blast, an answer no parent could give with honesty. While political leaders weighed timelines for the next strike or the next round of diplomacy, a quieter countdown began in living rooms and classrooms. How many months before power is fully restored in Iranian cities? How many years before Israeli first graders stop sketching rocket trails in colored chalk? How many lifetimes before the region's children learn a language other than fear? The international system, too, has been stress-tested by this conflict. Trump's unilateral ceasefire announcement via social media, bypassing traditional diplomatic channels, underscores a new era where personal proclamations can shift global dynamics overnight. The United Nations and nuclear non-proliferation frameworks, already strained, appear sidelined as military action overshadows inspection regimes. Meanwhile, whispers of potential support for Iran from powers like China, Russia, and even North Korea, though unconfirmed, raise the specter of a broader geopolitical realignment, with the United States' role as regional hegemon under scrutiny. As both Israel and Iran reassess their positions, multiple futures loom on the horizon. For Khamenei, the path forward could mean accelerating nuclear efforts in secret, seeking deterrence at any cost, or pursuing a face-saving diplomatic resolution to preserve regime stability. Internal pressures might even spark unforeseen change, though such speculation remains unverified. For Netanyahu, the temptation to strike again, should intelligence reveal lingering nuclear threats, remains strong, driven by a public united in viewing Iran as an existential danger. Yet each military action risks further isolating Israel in a neighborhood already hostile to its presence. One miscalculation could ignite a wider war, with nuclear stakes and regional chaos hanging in the balance. If Iran's enriched uranium, whose current location remains unclear, falls into play, or if Israeli preemption resumes without international restraint, the Middle East could become a powder keg beyond any leader's control. The Shadow War's brief emergence into open conflict has reshaped alliances, tested global norms, and left millions vulnerable. The question now is not just whether peace can hold, but whether the ancient hatreds and modern ambitions driving this rivalry can ever be reconciled. In the shifting sands of the Middle East, history teaches us that no ceasefire is permanent without addressing the root fears and aspirations of those who live there. Netanyahu and Khamenei, each bound by decades of conviction, stand at the precipice of decisions that will echo for generations. As the world watches, holding its breath, the story of Israel and Iran remains unwritten. Whether this marks the end of a shadow war or the beginning of something far more catastrophic, only time will tell. Subscribe now for more gripping stories, exclusive insights, and updates on this unfolding saga. Hit that button, join our community, and let's uncover the truth together.